Welcome to episode 34, everyone. This is a continuation, part 2 of the previous video. In this one, we'll be adding wet mud and standing water to the diorama base. You'll recall that in part 1, we cut some foam, we prepared a road or track surface, added some track imprints, and it's time to add some mud and standing water. Guys, by now you know this build is sponsored by Zululand Hobbies here in South Africa. Do check out their website, zululandhobbies.co.za. You'll remember that in part 1 I mentioned that I wanted to add a lot of wet mud to the diorama base. And this stage it looks a little bit like a desert surface, very dry, lacking the mud that we need to add, and this is something we'll be doing in this video. The first thing to do is to add some gloss varnish. In this case, I'm using one of the premium varnishes from Vallejo. This is really tough stuff. It's usually used on surfboards and helmets, and it gives a very lovely gloss finish. And this is applied with the airbrush. You can already see there a nice glossy surface and the wet mud coming along. This can also be applied with a brush, and that is the result. Certainly happy with that. Now before I start adding standing water, I first need to glue the M113 to the diorama base, and for this I'm using some ultra glue from M113, and of course this stuff dries completely clear. This is spread on the underside of the tracks as well as the nail I fixed earlier, and this is now pressed in place, and something like that, allowing the glue to dry. Now if you've been following me on Instagram, you'll recall that I built a little toolbox because the engine hatch is open, and this needs to be placed in front of the M113, but because there's so much mud, the toolbox will just sink into the muck, and no self-respecting mechanic will allow that to happen. So I needed something to place the toolbox on, and these cardboard sleeves from the Tamiya sea ration boxes is the perfect solution. And this is now carefully glued in place in front of the M113 where the mechanic tried to do some repairs. Just to make it look wet, I'm using a little bit of oil paint and a little bit of thinner, basically more thinner than paint, and just dabbing that onto the cardboard just to make it look wet. It's going to be the end result more or less there. I'll position the toolbox later. Now on to the standing water. I love this product from Vallejo, one of my favorites, the still water gel, and this will be combined with tan earth to do the standing water that we see in the reference pictures. Now to prepare this is very easy. Just put some of the acrylic liquid in a small tray, and then use a very small amount of Vallejo paint to tint the fluid. Make sure that you mix this up properly. In the past I made the mistake of adding too much paint to the fluid and then losing this semi-transparent look to the muddy water. Now initially I planned on applying this with the syringe. I saw a picture of someone else doing this, and I thought, well, this could be a cool idea, and I planned on placing small amounts of this liquid with the syringe on the diorama base. It was more or less successful for this little footprint, and then when I tried to apply a little bit more, instant disaster. So I gave this a second try, thinking, what's the odds of the same disaster happening twice? And there we've got the answer. It's very likely. Fortunately, this liquid is very thin, and it's very easy to spread with a little piece of stick or a brush even. And also good to do this just to pop any of the air bubbles that might have accumulated in the liquid. Now it's very important to allow enough drying time and to apply this in multiple layers. And 2 hours later this was the result, and all I needed to do now is use some of the clear liquid this time and just continue filling up the gaps in the track areas and on the diorama base itself. And the same was done to the road area, continuing adding the product to the deeper recessions. Guys, here's a few tips that I can give you after using this product on a few projects. Now, this is definitely not the method, but a few of the things that I learned. Pour thin layers. Please don't try to apply this product in a similar fashion as epoxy resin. This needs to be poured in multiple thin layers until you reach the desired water depth. Please don't try to accelerate drying. Example, using a desk fan. This will result in the product drying in an uneven fashion. It could result in the surface cracking. You can build up the depth by pouring multiple layers. Again, please don't try to do this in one go. Allow sufficient drying time between pours, at least 2 or 3 hours or even more. Rather, take your time. There is no undo button if things go wrong with water effects. And finally, remember, don't move the diorama base while the stuff is drying. You recall from a previous build with epoxy resin, this resulted in near disaster for me. So pour the liquid and put it on a shelf and let it dry in peace for at least 2 or 3 hours, preferably more. Now, this is the result after a few hours of drying, and the road surface certainly looks realistic, but you'll notice that the wheels and the tracks on the 113 still look very dry, and this is something that will have to be addressed if you want a realistic looking model. As a solution, I'm going to use some more gloss varnish, again the Vallejo Premium varnish. This is loaded into my Iwata airbrush, and this is now very carefully applied on the road wheels as well as the tracks, and any of the lower areas of the 113 that will be wet and muddy at this stage. This is really a lovely varnish. I can see myself using this for a number of applications again in future. And there we go. This is the result after applying all the varnish and all the Vallejo still water, and certainly moving along at a good pace. One of the things that I've noticed is because this product is so thin, it will take the contours of the diorama base, and you need to continuously keep on adding the Vallejo still water to reach the desired depth. One of the details I noticed in my reference pictures is that the lower ramp was always lowered onto a ammo box or a container of some sort, just to keep it out of the mud. Now, this little box I got from an old Italeri accessory kit, and I believe this was used for hand grenades during the Vietnam War. This would come in very handy for the rear ramp. This was pinned and painted, and the ramp can now be lowered to the correct level. And because this box will be standing in the mud, I'll need to add some to the sides, and I'm using the same technique I used in episode 33, and just adding some mud to the sides as the box would have been pushed into the mud by the weight of the rear ramp. A little bit of gloss varnish just nicely finishes the effect. Nice convincing muddy effect there. Certainly loving that. Next, I need to add some more weathering to the rear ramp, and for this I'm using a similar method with pigment that I used in episode 31. At this point, I also decided that the standing water needed to be a bit darker, and I mixed up a final mixture of flat earth from Vallejo and still water, and this time I applied it with the correct pipette. So there we go, the pigment has dried, and all that remains is to clean up that rear ramp. Again, I'm following the similar method that I used in a previous video, using some water and cotton buds, and just gently wiping off the excess pigment from that rear ramp. Now, because this vehicle is standing in so much wet mud, it's very likely that the crew would have left some muddy boot prints on the rear ramp, and this is again applied following the same method I did in the previous video, and with a small brush There you go, that's the result. Certainly loving this effect with the pigment and the mud mixture. All that remains now is to add some stowage. In this case, a few ammo cans, a few scratch bolt straps, and then some of the Tamiya sea rations to the rear ramp. That's a little helmet we made earlier. This is again glued in place with ultra glue. One of the final details that I would love to add is these coils of barbed wire that I see in quite a few of the reference pics. I use this product from Warlord Games. Very realistic looking barbed wire. This is actually just twisted wire. I rolled it into a coil similar to this, and because this is Vietnam where everything is wet and metal tended to rust, I added 3 Vallejo rust shades to the wire, and this was then placed on the 113. Guys, that is the final result. I'm over the moon with this. I can now move on to the greenery, the vegetation, but this now wraps up the mud and the standing water portion of this build. This is a list of all the products that I used, available from any good hobby shop. I'll be wrapping up the project very soon, so do follow the rest of this build on Instagram. Plenty of updates coming there. In the next video, I'll be looking at adding vegetation, a few of the tips and tricks I can give you there. So please join me for the next video.